I want to go as deeply underneath the problem as I can possibly manage tonight. So I'm going to marry some of my ideas about what you might describe as the grammatical structure of belief with some more overtly political analysis, concentrating on what constitutes ideology. Because one of the things that I've been trying to figure out, and I guess this is part of my attempt to wrestle with some of the actual problems that the postmodernists pose, because I don't mean as people or as thinkers, I mean conceptually, because you always have to give the devil his due, so to speak. And there are elements of postmodern thought, like the idea that there's an infinite number of interpretations for any finite set of facts that actually happen to be true, and they're quite problematic. And it's for good reasons as well as bad reasons that postmodernism has become such a dominant strain of thought. And so it's necessary to take it seriously. And one of the things I've been trying to figure out is there a reasonable way of distinguishing a philosophy from an ideology? And the postmodernist answer to that is basically no. That it's ideology all the way down, like the turtles all the way down. You never escape from the grip of your viewpoint in some sense. And there's some truth in that, but there's not enough truth. That's the thing. And one of the hallmarks, I would say, of both postmodern and ideological thinking is the proclivity to reduce very complex phenomena to single causes. But anyways, so we're going to go underneath things as far as we possibly can. So the first thing that I'd like to point out or like to discuss is the actual problem that we're all trying to solve in some sense, including the ideologues who claim to have the, let's say, interests of either the working class or the oppressed uppermost in their imagination, in their heart, or in their intellectual concerns. And there's absolutely no doubt that there is oppression and that there's no shortage of suffering in the world. And I do think that's not only the fundamental problem, but also the fundamental reality of the world. And this is an existential theme, and it was developed at least to some degree by Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger had a concept that he called thrownness, which is an interesting idea. And thrownness is a brief description of the arbitrary nature of human being, or even of being itself. And the arbitrary nature, the word he used for that, which is a German word, can be translated in other ways. It can be translated as abandon or dereliction or dejection, which obviously are much harsher words than mere thrownness. Thrownness is more of a detached term, but what it means is that it's a characteristic of human conscious experience to be underpinned by arbitrary realities that have nothing to do, in some sense, with your choice as a being. And so some of the elements of being thrown are that you're born at a certain time rather than a different time. That seems like it's an irrational fact. That's how Jung would describe it, Carl Jung. It's an irrational fact because there's no real way of accounting for it from a causal perspective, not subjectively speaking. And you're born a certain race and you're born with a certain level of intelligence, let's say, although that can be impaired certainly with enough effort. And you're born in a certain culture with a certain language and at a certain socioeconomic class and with a certain degree of attractiveness. And those are things that are all handed to you in some sense. They make up in some sense, they make up the axiomatic structure of your being. And some of them are advantageous and others are disadvantageous, and you're stuck with them. And that really is a problem, partly because life in and of itself is a problem and a problem of suffering, but also because it seems quite evident that, or at least that you could make a strong case that the talents and catastrophes of life are by no means equally distributed. And so in some sense there seems to be an intrinsic, we might regard it from the perspective of the standards of human justice and perhaps human mercy as well, as something intrinsically unfair or unjust about the structure of existence itself. Now I like the existentialist take on that because what the existentialists do is attribute that inequality and injustice and say unfairness to the structure of being itself and pose that as the central problem of life, and I find that very realistic. I like this painting by Van Gogh. I think it does a very good job of expressing that. You know, he's an old man and he's obviously sorrowful, and you know, he's not rich, as you can tell by his shoes, and like it's rough, and he's a nexus of oppression and perhaps a nexus of oppression in that he may have served as an oppressor, but also someone who's suffering and oppressed as a consequence of the conditions of his life. And so then the question might be, well, why is life like that? And that's where, and what might be done about it? And that's where the differences really start to arise. So we can start from the perspective of the fact that life presents a universal problem to those of us who are alive and conscious. Now, there are various, what would you call them, meta-theories that account for the existence of this suffering. My interpretation of the story of Genesis, essentially, which in some sense describes the introduction of suffering into the world, is that what seems to happen in the story of Genesis is that human beings originally emerge as a mythological representation, so it's a deep fictional representation. That's one way of thinking about it, keeping in mind, as you might, that fiction can be more true than truth, which is partly why we're so attracted to it, because fiction distills truth and presents it in a much more concentrated form than a mere description of everyday reality. And in the Genesis story, there seems to be an association between the development of vision and self-consciousness and the awareness of death and the awareness of good and evil. Those things happen pretty much at exactly the same time. And the consequence of that awareness of, or that self-consciousness is a dawning awareness of vulnerability. You remember in the story of Genesis when Adam and Eve open their eyes or have their eyes opened as a consequence of falling prey to temptation, the scales fall from their eyes and they realize that they're naked, and then they immediately cover themselves up. And of course, the question is, what does it mean to realize that you're naked? And there's a variety of complex answers to that. One is that, well, if you're naked, a common nightmare is to be naked in front of a crowd. And the reason that that's a nightmare is because, well, people don't like to have their full vulnerability exposed to the judgmental eye of the crowd. And for good reason. Like, everybody has, what would you say, maybe an inbuilt sense of shame about their fundamental inadequacy in relationship to the difficulties of life. And so the story of Genesis, which I think is a foundational story, well, I don't think it's a foundational story, it's obviously a foundational story of Western culture, suggests that it's mankind's knowledge of its own nature that leads to not only to suffering, but to work, you know, because once you realize that you're vulnerable and that vulnerability never really goes away, you always have to prepare for the future, because even if you solve the problems that are right in front of you this moment, that doesn't mean that you've solved the plethora of problems that are likely to pop up for you tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, and that in some sense are beyond your ability to finally solve. So, but there's a different viewpoint, I think, that comes out of the Marxist perspective, and I'm going to talk to you about Marxism and postmodernism, both of which I regard as variant strands of the same ideology. And as I said, I'll define why I think they're ideological. And the thing that strikes me so clearly about the Marxist perspective is that the finger is always pointed at inadequate social order as the root cause of suffering. And that just seems to me to be, I don't know, it's so naive that it's difficult to understand why people can possibly fall for it. Maybe it's partly because there's some hope embedded in it, right? There's an idea that, well, suffering might be transcended if we could just organize our societies properly, but it seems to me, number one, that that's highly unlikely, and number two, as Dostoevsky pointed out, even if we did organize our societies so that no one had anything to worry about from a material perspective, so everyone, let's say, had enough bread and shelter, that we're the kind of insane creatures that would blow that apart and fragment that sort of static utopian perfection just so something strange and interesting might happen. And I think that's a really devastating critique. And you know, Dostoevsky formulated that back in the late 1800s he had thought through the consequences of communist utopia before it even manifested itself as a political force, and I think put his finger on exactly at least one of its primary weaknesses. So, you know, if we were delivered from suffering, it's not necessarily clear that we would be happy about that, because one of the things that does characterize human beings is this intense desire for experience that transcends the normative, you know, and people will go out and look for difficult things to do just for the sake of doing difficult things. They climb mountains and they engage in extreme sports and they put their lives in danger, and there's no technical reason for that, and it doesn't seem like a very intelligent thing to do from the pure perspective of self-preservation, but we're certainly capable of it. And the problem, the Marxists seem to lay the reason for suffering at the foot of inadequate social structure, but they go farther than that. They also describe the social structure as it exists, and this is where the idea of the patriarchy is derived, as far as I'm concerned, as something that is necessarily an upper class or an oppressive class against the oppressed class. And what the people who fit in those different categories can vary. With classic Marxism, it was the rich against the poor, or the poor against the rich, right? The bourgeoisie against the proletariat, and that's been transformed, I would say, by the postmodernists using a fairly self-evident sleight of hand into identity politics, where the oppressed-oppressor narrative just takes different forms according to the identity that happens to be plugged into the same ideational structure. And what seems to happen as a consequence of that, and I mean there's pretty good data about this with regards to the genesis of intense intergroup conflict. One of the things that predicts intense intergroup conflict, like the conflict in Rwanda, and certainly also happened in Nazi Germany, is that genocidal activities are often marketed as preemptive strikes against an oppressor class, right? And so that would have been the Jews in Germany, and in Rwanda, the same narrative emerged. It's very common to dichotomize the society as oppressor and oppressed, and then for the oppressed to rise up and take out the so-called oppressors even before anything of any particular violence occurs, because of this enhanced sense of victimization and the moral high ground that it seems to provide. The logic being something like, if we're being oppressed, then we have every right to defend ourselves, so to speak, even against threats that are only in some way imaginary. Now, I don't want to get too cut and dried about that, because, you know, it certainly is the case that there isn't a political or economic system in the entire world that lacks corruption. And so the idea that the social structure is in part corrupt enough so that everyone who is embodied in that social structure doesn't necessarily have an equal chance to manifest their gifts, say, and rise to the top is certainly true, because human beings are completely incapable of producing perfect social structures for a variety of reasons. Our own blindness, the fact that we inherit structures that we don't really understand, that are all demented and bent in one way or another. And so there's always an element of truth to critical claims that if we just got our act together better from a social perspective, that everything would be more fair and just. But to say that is not to simultaneously justify the claim that all the reasons that human beings are suffering and that life is unfair and unjust is because the social structure is corrupt and oppressive, right? You got to think in multivariate terms if you have any degree of intelligence at all. And for any complex phenomena, there's generally a multitude of causes, and they are not easy to differentiate. I mean, that's partly what social scientists do, is to take a look at a complex outcome, suffering certainly being one of those, and to look at the potential contributors of a multitude of factors. Now, it's very difficult because those factors are not easy to categorize and they overlap and so on and so forth, but you have to be pretty, what would you say, motivated and stupid, I would say, both at the same time, to use a univariate hypothesis to account for a complex phenomena. I don't care what the phenomena is. And so that's another hallmark of ideological thinking, is that the causal story collapses into a single dimension. You see that often in psychopathology too, where, you know, people who get obsessive about something can't shake like a particular idea that possesses them. Paranoid people are like that. And People who have eating disorders, especially anorexia, are like that, is their entire value structure collapses into the dimension of thin equals beautiful and good. And it's very rigid and black and white, and it does them absolutely no good. So now some of the problems with the Marxist perspective seems to be that victimhood, a sense of enhanced victimhood, tends to produce an intense sense of resentment, and that's a very bad idea because resentment is a very toxic and violent emotion. It's also very ungrateful, which is one of the things I would really say about especially the radical left student types, especially at Ivy League universities. I mean, it's really quite a spectacle to see people at places like Yale come out and agitate as a consequence of the realization of their own oppression, when by any reasonable standard, current or historical, they're probably in the top 1/100%, perhaps better than that, of all the people who have ever lived anywhere, ever. And so it's really quite staggering to me that the top 0.001% can express their resentment about the top 0.0001% in such strident terms without noticing that exactly the same claims of privilege apply to them by all you have to do is transform the bin in which you're doing the privilege comparisons, and that becomes immediately self-evident. And you know, the fact that as Americans, let's say, or as North Americans, since I'm a Canadian, that we're staggeringly privileged compared to the rest of the world is certainly a consequence of what you might describe as the arbitrariness of our political borders. And so, but to forget that when you're claiming a particular brand of oppression for yourself seems to me to be very ungrateful at the least, and certainly motivated, let's say, politically, because I think it justifies your expression of hatred for that tiny fraction of people who are still better off than you, and also a degree of historical ignorance that's absolutely staggering in its magnitude, and a complete indictment of our education system, which should be indicted in every possible way. So, now, the Marxists might claim to their benefit, let's say, with this worldview of class struggle as being the primary driver of human history and the well-off socioeconomically, because that's pretty much the only way they define well-off, which is also something I take great objection to, because there's lots of hierarchies in the world, and there are many important hierarchies, and not all of them can be reduced to socioeconomic status by any stretch of the imagination. Imagine if you were 80 years old and you had $20 million, you know, you might be perfectly happy to get rid of all that money if you could be 18 again. So and you know, one of the best predictors of wealth in North America is actually age, because you know, young people haven't actually had much time to make money, whereas old people have had quite a bit of time, but the problem with being old and rich is that you're still old. And that actually turns out to be quite a serious problem, because no matter how rich you are, you eventually die. And so the money has a very delimited effect with regards to addressing the fundamental problems of the suffering of life. And we know perfectly well from the empirical perspective that once you have enough money so that the bill collectors aren't chasing you around, essentially, something like the beginnings of a middle-class existence, or maybe the upper end of the working class, then additional money has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on your psychological well-being. And that's actually an indication of the limitations of material comfort, let's say, as a medication for the suffering that's attendant on life. It's another thing that's very weak about the Marxists, and I think very interestingly contradictory, because they're very anti-capital in their structure, but they're so damn materialistic that it's absolutely mind-boggling, because the Marxists are actually more convinced that money is useful than most capitalists, as far as I can tell, because they believe that money is in fact the solution to all life's problems. The problem is that just the right people don't have the money. And I think that's a staggeringly naive perspective, because there's many problems in life that money just cannot solve, and there's a fair number of them that it actually makes worse. So, anyways, having said all that, you could also still make the case. I used to work for a socialist party in Canada when I was a kid, about the time I was 14 till the time I was about 17, before I figured out what was wrong, not so much with socialism per se, but with ideology per se. And I actually admired the socialist leaders that I had the fortune to be introduced to, because at that point they were very much voice for the working class, a lot of union leaders and people like that, so they're classic democratic socialists on the labor end of the distribution. And it's absolutely necessary for labor and the working class to have a political voice, something the Democrats might keep in mind. So, and maybe they wouldn't lose their elections quite so frequently. No, I really think it's appalling, because it's necessary for the working class to have a political voice. So, and to have that transformed into identity politics is a real catastrophe. Anyways, I think that the people that I met, many of them were genuinely concerned with the problems of the working class, and more power to them. And so I think there are people on the left who genuinely are trying to make a difference for people who could use a fair shot at opportunity in life. But at the same time, I noticed that a tremendous number of especially the lower end worker, party worker, protester types were more peevish and resentful than good-hearted and kind. And it was about that time that I came across George Orwell's famous critique of left-wing thinking in the UK in a book called Road to Whig and Peer, where he basically made the claim that the socialists that he knew, especially the middle-class ones, didn't give a damn about the poor, they just hated the rich. And that is something worth thinking about for a very long period of time, because hatred actually turns out to be a very powerful motivation. And if you think about the sorts of things that happened in the Soviet Union and all these places that were supposed to be workers' paradises, if you look at the outcome and you had to infer whether it was goodness of heart and kind-heartedness and care for the working man that produced the genocides, or outright bitter resentment and hatred, it's a lot easier to draw a causal path from the negative emotion to the outcome than from the positive, kind-hearted benevolence to the outcome. You just don't get gulags out of benevolence. That's just not how it works. So I think the bloody historical evidence is clear, although I have read the most convoluted, pathological, pathetic, twisted rationalizations of what happened, say, in Stalinist Russia that you could possibly manufacture. It's as if a stack of corpses that would reach halfway to the moon isn't enough evidence for the pathology of a certain form of belief. So, well, some people can't be convinced by anyone's death but their